Hi, everybody, and welcome to Know What You're Talking About. Today, we're looking at topic 5, DQ2. This has to do with GDP, gross domestic product. You hear this topic a lot in the news. It's an interesting topic to look at. So our discussion question says, according to the article, what does GDP really tell us about economic growth? Located in topic materials, Khan discusses the pitfalls of GDP. Describe how these pitfalls have affected the overall economic status of a country. Conduct research to find an example of a country that has been affected by the pitfalls of GDP and describe the circumstances surrounding the country's position. Okay, a couple of things that you should know before you approach this DQ. First of all, Khan writes about the UK, the United Kingdom, Great Britain. This is not the United States. Not like these things don't apply, they certainly do. But when you see things like ONS, Office of National Statistics, they have one of those in the UK, but not in the US. It's a little bit different. Second thing, this whole thing about conduct research to find an example of a country that's been affected by the pitfalls, I don't want you to get too terribly caught up in that. That's kind of unusual for me to say. I'm always looking for more detail. But I don't want to turn this into a paper. So look at a couple of countries that you might know or be interested in. Give me a couple of examples. Good enough. What I want you to focus on here is, what does GDP mean? What does it measure? What does it not measure? And therefore, what are the pitfalls? So GDP, according to our textbook, this is the glossary of our textbook, by the way, and if you haven't found the glossary, you absolutely should. Click right there to get to the glossary. So in the glossary of our textbook, it tells us that gross domestic product, GDP, is the market value of all final goods and services produced inside the borders of a nation during one fiscal year. So what we're really talking about is, what has this nation produced? What has this nation produced? And what's the market value of everything that it has produced? If you look at everything that's produced within a nation, and especially if you compare that year over year, it tells you a little something about how efficiently that nation is using its resources. Remember that production possibilities curve from the first week? And we talked about finite resources and alternative ways of using them. Are we using all resources efficiently? And that's one of the things that you can notice from GDP. And as GDP grows, that means that we're using our resources more and more and more efficiently. And possibly it also means that we're growing our resources. Natural resources, of course, don't tend to grow, but things like labor and entrepreneurship do grow. You might have new ideas, or you might have more people that come into the country that are ready to work. So that's one of the things that GDP tells us. Khan, in his article, takes a crack at GDP by talking about, when you look at GDP per capita, it's not growing. Okay. GDP per capita is simply GDP divided by population. Per capita means per person. So how much GDP has been generated per person? First of all, it's a fallacy to think that that indicates average income. It does not. It just means that for every man, woman, and child in this nation, this is how much GDP has been generated per person. Secondly, you can see that if GDP stayed the same, but population grew, then your GDP per capita might actually decline. And that's one of the things that they're seeing in the United Kingdom at the time of this article that Khan wrote. And by the way, this article that Khan wrote is several years old, and the United Kingdom, about 3 weeks ago, voted to leave the European Union, and that's caused all kinds of upset in their economy. And so going forward, they might have to revisit all these issues again and look at how their growth is actually doing. That's another story, and that's a side story. Khan looks at GDP per capita. It is true that if GDP stays the same, but population grows, your GDP per capita will decline. It's also true that even if GDP grows, but population grows at a faster rate, it'll still decline. So you often see this in for instance, African nations and some of the third world countries where population growth is really extreme. It's hard for them to generate enough GDP growth to actually see an increase in GDP per capita. What does GDP not measure? I think I just talked about that GDP is not a measure of income. Income distribution is a whole nother subject. And average income and median income, these are separate topics. This is not directly related to GDP, except GDP measures what we produce. And when we produce things, we have to have workers to produce those things, right? So when GDP is high and growing, unemployment tends to be reduced. You need workers to get that production that's measured in GDP. If everybody has a job, then everybody has a paycheck, and therefore you could say that there's a relationship with income, but income is not distributed evenly across all sectors of the society. We know that from our own personal experience, right? And so what I want you to talk about is, what is GDP? What is GDP per capita? What does GDP not measure? And some of those things are included in the Kahn article. And within the next few days, I'll put up another post that's titled along the lines of, is money the only measure of economic well-being? And this post, this thread, will look at a whole host of other measures that have been proposed as ways to measure economic well-being. Everything from education levels to levels of violent crime, all kinds of things. And I'll let you take a look at that and see if you think that some of these measures might make sense also. So with that information, I think you have enough to get going on this. Write me a great response so I can give you 100% on this DQ. And I look forward to seeing you next time on Know What You're Talking About.